in the broadest sense, what kind of work is playing video games? In other words, what happens when we start thinking of playing video games not as a break from work, but as the work itself, as a career? And this is, of course, often the way that eSports is discussed. And this, depending on where you're coming to this topic from, may not be a surprise at all, or may be kind of a big surprise. Esports is really big business right now. And not only do we kind of have prize pools in the millions, we have, very large spectatorships. We're even having scholarships at not just the collegiate levels, but even high school and earlier for people to come play video games. And the second question, why are so many of those who play video games for a living Asian men? And again, depending on when you're coming to this, you may know or not know this by the end of the talk. If you don't, you'll certainly know a little bit more about that, but also what some of the implications are of that. I think there are some real affordances and also challenges in that sometimes. So some are familiar with esports, some may have not heard about it at all, but may also be very familiar with some of the other concepts that I'm talking about, thinking about race, gender, masculinity in media, in video games. And there are some people who may be very familiar with esports, but may never have considered how those particular issues are also at play. Gold farming, and these are, just to set this up, on the left here are a couple images from a documentary on gold farming by Ge Jin in the early 2000s. And then on the right, two separate documentaries about celebrity esports. So these are celebrity teams and team houses in China and South Korea, respectively. The focus here was on how similar, in fact, things looked in terms of working conditions, demographics, and of course the perceived kind of novelty of being paid to play video games. So gold farming, which you may have heard of in the late 1990s and early 2000s, was kind of a global phenomenon, but increasingly associated with China. And it was the idea of harvesting in-game assets or currency and then selling it for out-of-game sovereign currency to players who were looking to kind of accelerate the leveling up process. And so although a lot of people, when they hear about esports, may be thinking about some of those kind of glitzier, large arenas, spectator spectacles, in fact, I've been really interested in thinking about the similarities kind of that happen behind the scenes and thinking about each individual industry as, in fact, deeply precarious, deeply disposable, and arguably esports is one that depends even more on that precarity and disposability, given the very short career longevity of esports players on average, specifically talking about League. In particular, thinking about some of the discourses around race and racialized stereotypes and national stereotypes that we have inherited in esports from gold farming, and before that from a longer history of Asian labor, often characterized as a kind of sweatshop labor, which gold farms were, but also thinking about this discourse and this concept of quote-unquote cheap Chinese labor, characterizing and shaping the way that Asian players, their play styles, were often described in terms of sort of robotic, inexhaustible, even automated. And I think this is also something that we continue to see shaping the way that Asian esports players are discussed. How they have been seen to work historically is also shaping the way that they are now seen to play or not play in this sort of humorless way. So recently, for example, Nike has pursued collaborations with international esports teams or leagues like the Chinese League of Legends League. And for me, the promotional materials that have come out of this are so fascinating because on the surface level, they are efforts to legitimate esports. In other words, to frame the esports players, in this case, Chinese esports players, as athletes. They consistently focus on the perceived failures of these athletes, these so-called athletes, to perform what are framed as kind of rudimentary physical activities or basic kind of weightlifting. In that way, there's a criticism of their inability to resemble either physically or mentally through these kinds of ideas of grit and sportsmanship and masculinity, definitions of an athlete that have been established, at least starting in the US, but ultimately globally, within a kind of black and white binary. is suggesting that it's not really just about having a body, but a very specific kind of body in terms of that body's race, gender, nationality, linguistic ability, or expression that renders it acceptably athletic and especially sort of acceptably American. So that logic of esports, or that narrative of esports being traced back to a game called StarCraft in the early 2000s in South Korea is one that is kind of people are most familiar with, especially the kind of arenas and the very, very large number of people willing to watch others play video games. You know, part of why Chinese athletes interrupt this kind of marketing narrative is because they aren't American. But furthermore, and the reason that I mentioned that kind of white-black binary as shaping some of our ideas about athleticism is because of the way that esports simultaneously sort of relies on, but also rejects the bodies of young Asian men is really an echo of, I think, the conflicting ways that Black men have historically been represented in collegiate and professional sports.